The house was eerily quiet. Not a sound, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. The lights flickered for a moment. In the dim glow, a figure moved, a young woman, her face pale, hands trembling as she opened the door. Her name was Clara. She had always been quiet, reserved. Her parents barely noticed her. Her room, the only place she felt safe. She sat down at her desk, staring at the screen. CCTV footage played. A blurry figure appeared on the screen. It was her father. But something was wrong. His face was distorted, twisted in an unnatural way. Clara gasped, pressing her hands against her mouth. She rewound the footage, her heart pounding. It was impossible, wasn't it? Her father, her protector, was involved in something terrible. She couldn't believe her eyes. But there it was, clear as day. Her father, standing in a dark alley. In the footage, he passed something to a man. A small, brown envelope. The man looked around nervously before disappearing into the shadows. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. She was frozen. A sense of dread washed over her. Her mind raced. What was this? Why was he doing this? She felt as if the walls were closing in. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, as if the world itself was closing in. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. The truth was staring her in the face, but she didn't want to see it. Her father, the man she trusted, was hiding something. Something awful. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't make herself press the keys. The footage played on. Her hands were clammy. Her eyes never left the screen. Then, the door creaked open behind her. She froze, heart in her throat. The door creaked open slowly. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She didn't dare turn around. Footsteps echoed softly, deliberately. She held her breath. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with tension. A shadow fell across the floor. Her father. His presence loomed behind her. Clara's pulse quickened. She couldn't move. Her mind screamed for her to look at him. But she couldn't. The weight of the truth pressed against her. Her father's voice broke the silence. "Clara, what are you doing?" His words were calm, but they didn't reach her. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide, refusing to acknowledge him. She couldn't speak. Her mind was a blur of confusion and fear. She finally turned her head, slowly. Her father stood there, his face unreadable. The room felt colder, darker. His eyes met hers. She saw nothing familiar in them. He took a step forward. "I asked you a question." Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why what?" he replied, his tone laced with a strange calmness. Clara's eyes flicked back to the screen. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the footage. Why did you do that?" she whispered, barely able to choke out the words. Her father stared at the screen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he moved closer. His hand reached out to her shoulder. Clara flinched at his touch. His fingers dug into her skin, a silent warning. "You're not supposed to know," he said softly. Clara's body stiffened, but she couldn't look away from him. "Not supposed to know?" she repeated, disbelief clouding her voice. Her mind was racing. The man on the footage, the deal in the dark alley. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her father wasn't the man she thought he was. "Get rid of it," he said sharply. "Now!" Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Her father's grip tightened on her shoulder. "Clara, you don't understand." His voice was colder now. Clara stood up quickly, her legs weak, unsteady. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, her voice shaking. Her father's eyes darkened. He took a step back, his jaw clenched. "You're too young to understand." Clara felt the weight of his words, but something inside her snapped. She had to know. She couldn't go on living in the dark any longer. Clara's heart raced as she stepped away from him. She couldn't let him control this moment. She couldn't just accept his words and move on. "No," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Her father looked at her with a cold, distant gaze. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and menacing. Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her mind raced with the possibilities, the truth that had been hiding for so long. She turned back to the screen, unwilling to back down. Her eyes locked on the footage of her father in the alley. The man who had always protected her, guided her. Was this really who he was? The questions echoed in her mind. Why was he involved in this? What had he done? Her thoughts blurred as a heavy silence settled between them. Then, without warning, her father lunged forward, slamming the power button on the computer. The screen went black. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The tension in the room was suffocating. Her eyes darted back to him. She could feel the anger, the fear, rising inside her. "You can't hide this forever," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father didn't respond. His silence was worse than any words. For a moment, he stood still, watching her closely. Clara's body trembled, but she refused to look away. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, her father broke the silence. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his tone colder than ever. Clara's stomach dropped. She didn't know what he meant, but the fear in his voice told her she was getting closer to something terrifying. The truth was just out of reach, but she could feel it. It was real, and it was worse than she imagined. Her father stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "I will protect you from this," he said, his voice sharp and final. But Clara knew she wasn't safe anymore. Not from the secrets, not from the lies. Not from the man who had raised her. Clara's hands shook, but she steadied herself, refusing to let him see how terrified she was. "You can't protect me from this," she whispered, her voice steadying. "You've been hiding it from me all this time." Her father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous passing through them. For a moment, he seemed to reconsider his next move. Then, in one swift motion, he reached for the door. Clara's breath hitched. Was he leaving? Was this over? But instead of leaving, he slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. Her heart pounded as she looked at him. "What are you going to do now?" she demanded. Her voice trembled, but she kept her ground. "I'm going to keep you safe," he replied, his voice low, almost too calm. The way he said it sent a chill through her. His words weren't comforting, they were threatening. Clara backed away, her body pressed against the wall as her father stepped closer. The air felt thick with tension. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch out, swallowing everything. She could barely breathe. "Don't try to run," he warned, his gaze hardening. "You won't get far." The fear in his voice, in his eyes, made Clara's stomach churn. He wasn't just hiding something from her. He was involved in something much darker than she could have ever imagined. Her mind raced, tried to process everything. The footage, the dark alley, the secret meetings. Her father wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was trying to control her, to keep her in the dark. But Clara couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't just let him walk away with his secrets. "I don't care how far I have to go," she said, her voice more forceful now. "I'm going to find out the truth." Her father's face hardened, his jaw tight. "You don't understand, Clara. If you keep digging, you'll never be safe again." The words hung in the air like a warning, a dark promise. But Clara wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of what he might be hiding, and that fear was stronger than anything he could do to her. Her father took another step toward her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to the door, unlocking it. Clara stood frozen, her heart racing as he opened it and disappeared into the darkness of the house. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Clara alone in the silence. Her breath was shaky, but she forced herself to stand tall. What was happening? Was this really her father? The man who had always been there for her, who had promised to protect her. Now, she wasn't sure who he was anymore. The darkness in the room felt suffocating, but Clara couldn't move. She stared at the closed door, her mind racing with thoughts of the footage, the man in the alley, the coldness in her father's eyes. Something was terribly wrong. She had to know more. She couldn't back down now. Her hand hovered over the desk again, fingers trembling as she reached for the mouse. The computer was off, but Clara turned it back on, her eyes fixed on the screen as the familiar login page appeared. Her heart skipped a beat. It felt like she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But she couldn't stop now. She had to uncover the truth. She typed in the password, her hands slick with sweat. The screen flickered, and then the CCTV footage came back to life. Her father had been standing in the alley, yes. But who was the man he had met? Who was he handing the envelope to? Clara's fingers moved quickly, rewinding the footage. This time, she wasn't going to look away. This time, she was going to find out exactly what her father had been hiding. As the video played, Clara leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. There was something about the man, something familiar. She couldn't quite place it, but the more she stared, the more it bothered her. Her breath caught when she realized who it was. It was someone from her past, someone she hadn't seen in years. A childhood friend, a boy she once trusted. But why was he with her father? Clara's hands began to shake as the realization hit her. This was bigger than she thought. Her father was involved in something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. Her head spun with the questions she needed answers to. Why had her father been meeting with him? What had he given him? What was the envelope? She had to find out. She couldn't stop now. She had come too far. But deep down, Clara knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. Clara sat there, her eyes fixed on the screen, her mind racing with the gravity of what she had just uncovered. The name of the boy, no. The man started to form in her mind. She couldn't believe it. It was Jason. Jason, her childhood friend. The one who had disappeared years ago, without a trace. The one her father had never spoken about again. Her heart began to pound faster. Jason had been part of her world once, a close friend before the shadows of the past had swallowed him whole. And now, here he was, meeting her father in secret, exchanging something she couldn't yet understand. What had happened to him? What had he become? Clara's mind swirled with all the possibilities. The empty, unanswered questions she had buried for so long were now surfacing with terrifying clarity. Her father, her protector, wasn't the man she had thought he was. She couldn't look away from the footage. There it was, her father, slipping the envelope into Jason's hand. The moment felt frozen in time, heavy with the weight of all the secrets between them. The door to her room creaked open again. Clara didn't need to look up to know who it was. Her father was back. He didn't speak. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, as he stood there, watching her. She could feel his eyes on her back, the cold presence of his stare. Clara couldn't breathe. She had to face him. She couldn't run away anymore. With a shaky breath, she turned to face him. "You knew he was alive," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of a raw intensity. "You knew Jason was alive this whole time." Her father didn't move. He didn't even blink. His expression was unreadable. The tension between them felt like a live wire, crackling with unspoken truths. "You were never supposed to know," he said, his voice low, almost distant. Clara shook her head, her chest tight with frustration. "You were protecting him, not me. You didn't want me to find out the truth." Her father took a step closer, his face growing darker, his jaw clenched tightly. "I was protecting you from the truth, Clara. The truth is far more dangerous than you can imagine." Clara's mind raced. "What truth? What is it you've been hiding? Why is Jason involved in all of this?" Her father didn't answer right away. He stood there, as though considering whether to tell her. Clara felt the weight of his silence press against her. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's bigger than you think. It's not just about him. It's about everything I've done, everything I've been a part of. And if you keep digging, you'll never be the same again." Clara's stomach twisted. The fear in his eyes was something she had never seen before. "What do you mean? What's going on, Dad?" Her father's face softened, a brief flicker of regret passing through his features, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "This is not your fight, Clara. You don't know what you're getting into." Clara didn't care. She couldn't back down now. "I need to know, Dad. I need to understand why you've kept this from me." For the first time, her father looked away, his gaze distant. And that's when Clara saw it. The briefest glimpse of fear in his eyes. It was a look that chilled her to the core. Her father wasn't just hiding something. He was running from it. Clara's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. Her father wasn't just protecting her from the truth. He was trying to protect himself. From what? She didn't have to ask. The fear in his eyes spoke louder than any words could. There was something terrible lurking beneath the surface. Something that had been festering in the shadows for years. And now it was threatening to unravel everything. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the walls closing in. She was suffocating. Her father's voice broke the silence, low and strained. "Clara, don't you understand? Some things are better left buried." Clara couldn't hold it in any longer. "I deserve to know, Dad. I'm not a child anymore." His eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else too. A flicker of guilt, quickly masked by coldness. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking for the truth," Clara shot back, her voice gaining strength. "Why are you involved with Jason? What's in the envelope? What's really going on?" Her father's hand clenched into a fist, and Clara could see the struggle in his face. He was torn between telling her everything and keeping her in the dark forever. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. Finally, he let out a sharp exhale. "It's not just Jason, Clara. It's everything. Everything I've done, everything I've been a part of. If you knew, you wouldn't look at me the same way. I can't let that happen." Clara's mind raced, her thoughts spinning faster than she could process them. Her father had been involved in something so dark that he couldn't even bring himself to say it aloud. And Jason, her childhood friend, the boy she thought was lost, was tied to it. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Tell me everything." Her father took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. He was no longer the man who had raised her, the man who had once seemed so invincible. He was a stranger now, a man with a past she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I made a choice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A choice that will haunt me for the rest of my life." Clara's pulse raced as she leaned in closer. "What choice?" Her father's eyes darkened, his voice heavy with regret. "The envelope, it was a deal. With people who don't forget, Clara. They never forget. They came to me years ago, and I thought I could control it. I thought I could protect you from it. But now it's too late." Clara's throat tightened, and her world seemed to tilt as her father's words sank in. "What do you mean? Too late?" He shook his head, his expression filled with helplessness. "You're already involved, whether you realize it or not. The moment you started digging into the past, you became part of it. And now, there's no turning back." Clara felt a cold, heavy sensation settled deep in her chest. She had known something was wrong, but she never imagined it would be like this. Her life, her family, everything she thought she knew, it was all crumbling in front of her. "Who are they?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father's eyes flickered toward the door, as though checking for anyone listening. He leaned in closer, his breath ragged. "I can't tell you that. They're dangerous. And you don't want to know." Clara felt her hands tremble, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I need to know, Dad. I need to understand what we're up against." Her father's face twisted in pain, as though the weight of his past was too much to bear. "I'm sorry, Clara. I never wanted you to be a part of this. I never wanted you to see the darkness inside of me." Clara stepped back, her mind reeling. The man she had trusted her whole life had been living in a world of lies. And now she was tangled in it too. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in her life, she realized just how far-reaching the shadows in her family really were, and just how dangerous it would be to uncover every truth that Clara's thoughts raced, her mind grappling with the weight of everything her father had just confessed. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of questions, each one more suffocating than the last. Her father was involved with dangerous people. He had made deals that tied their lives to forces beyond their control. And now, no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she was part of it too. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists. She couldn't just sit back and let this consume her. She couldn't let her father's mistakes define her, and she certainly couldn't allow herself to become a pawn in whatever game he had been playing for all these years. "I don't care who they are," Clara said, her voice filled with determination. "I need to find out what they want and why you're involved. This is bigger than you and me now, isn't it? Her father's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to protect her from something. Something far worse than he'd already told her. Clara, listen to me, he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperation. You don't know what you're asking for. This goes deeper than you could ever imagine. The people I've dealt with, they don't forgive. They don't forget. And if they think you're involved, if they think you know too much, they'll come for you. Clara's stomach twisted in fear, but she refused to back down. She had to know the truth. The man she had loved and trusted her whole life wasn't just a father. He was part of something dark and dangerous. And if she was going to survive, she had to understand it all. Then I'll protect myself, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm not afraid anymore, Dad. I'll do whatever it takes to find out what's going on. Her father looked at her, his expression a mix of pride and sorrow. I wish you would listen to me, Clara. You don't know what you're dealing with. Once you open that door, once you start digging deeper, there's no going back. You'll never be the same again. Clara stepped away from him, the anger in her chest burning hotter. I don't care. I won't live in the dark anymore. I won't let you protect me from the truth, if it means living a lie. Her father's face twisted in anguish. You have no idea how dangerous this is. I was trying to shield you from a world you can't understand. But now, his voice trailed off, and for a moment, Clara saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anything he had said. Regret, fear, guilt. I'm already in this, she said, her voice quiet but firm. And I'm going to finish it, no matter what. Her father's shoulders slumped as he stepped back. You're making a mistake, Clara. A mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. But Clara wasn't listening anymore. The fog of confusion that had clouded her mind for so long was beginning to clear. She wasn't afraid of the truth anymore, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. She had to find out what her father was hiding. She had to understand the deal he'd made, the man who had come back into their lives after all these years. She couldn't stop now, not after everything she had learned. And there was one thing Clara knew for sure. There would be no turning back from this. Clara's mind was set. There was no going back. She could feel the weight of her decision, but it was too late to change her course. Her father's warning echoed in her ears, but the resolve inside her grew stronger with every passing second. Her father's presence in the room seemed to close in around her. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the vulnerability he'd never shown before. But she couldn't let that stop her. She couldn't let his fear define her anymore. She was no longer a child, afraid of the unknown. She was a woman, and the truth was something she deserved, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Clara turned back to the computer. The screen flickered as it powered back on, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She opened the file again, the footage that had changed everything. Her hands were steady now, the fear replaced by a single-minded determination. The alley. Jason. Her father. The envelope. She fast-forwarded through the footage, her eyes scanning every second. She needed to see more, understand more. Then, something caught her eye. A blurry figure in the background. Someone she hadn't noticed before. The person was watching from a distance, standing in the shadows. Their face was obscured, but there was something familiar about the posture, the way they moved. Clara's heart skipped. Could it be someone else from her past? Someone who was tied to her father's secret? She paused the footage and zoomed in, but it was still unclear. Her pulse quickened as she took a screenshot and opened a new window to search for clues. She needed answers, and she couldn't let anything slip through her fingers. A few frantic moments later, Clara found a match. The blurry figure in the shadows. It was another face from her childhood. Someone who had disappeared, just like Jason. Her mind was reeling now, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together. But the truth felt more terrifying with every discovery. Her father wasn't just involved with dangerous people. He was tangled in something far deeper, something that reached back into her own history. But Clara couldn't stop now. She had found a thread, and she was going to pull on it until it unraveled everything. She turned to her father, who had been standing in the corner, watching her silently. His face was unreadable, but Clara could see the hint of fear in his eyes. She had reached a point where he could no longer control her. I know who they are, she said, her voice steady but filled with cold certainty. And I know what you've done. Her father didn't respond immediately. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. But Clara didn't back down. You've been hiding this from me for years. But I'm not going to let you protect me from the truth anymore. I want answers, and I'm going to get them. Her father's eyes flickered with emotion, anger, regret, and something else she couldn't quite identify. You don't understand, Clara, he said, his voice a low growl. You think you're ready for this, but you're not. These people, they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And now that you've started looking, they'll come for you. And I won't be able to protect you anymore. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. She had been afraid of her father's secrets, but she was more afraid of the life she would live if she didn't face them. I'm already in this, she said firmly, her voice unwavering. And I'm not going to stop. I'll find Jason. I'll find everyone involved. I'll get the truth, no matter what. Her father's face twisted in anguish, but Clara saw the resignation in his eyes. He knew there was no stopping her now. The truth was out there, and nothing would ever be the same again. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest as her father took a slow, deliberate step toward her. His face was etched with a mixture of regret and something darker, something that hinted at the gravity of what was to come. You have no idea what you're asking for, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. This isn't just a game, Clara. These people, they're not like anyone you've ever known. They'll destroy everything in their path to protect their secrets. Clara's mind was made up. She couldn't back down now. She'd seen too much, uncovered too much. There was no turning back from this path. I'm not afraid of them, she said, her voice hardening with determination. I've been living in the dark for too long. I need to know the truth. I need to understand what you've done. And I need to understand why Jason came back. What's so dangerous about him? Her father's eyes flickered, the faintest trace of fear passing through them, but he quickly masked it. It's not about Jason, he said, his voice strained. It's about you. I've kept you away from this for a reason. You were supposed to be safe. But now that you know too much, they'll come for you. They'll come for both of us. Clara's stomach twisted with fear, but she didn't let it show. She stood tall, facing him without flinching. Then we'll face them together, she said, her words as firm as steel. I'm not backing down, Dad. I'll find the answers. I'll find out who they are, and I'll make sure no one can hurt us. Her father's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was fleeting. You think you're ready for this, he said, almost to himself. You think you're strong enough, but you're not. They'll use you, Clara. They'll make you part of their game, and there won't be any way out once you're in. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't be part of something this dark. She wouldn't let herself be used. She had to be in control, in command of her own fate. I'm not afraid, she repeated, her voice unwavering. I'll find Jason. I'll find out what's in that envelope. And I'll find out what you've done. Her father's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Clara saw a man completely broken, a man who had made too many choices that led him down a path he could never undo. But there was no time for pity. There was no time for hesitation. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words barely audible. I didn't want you to get caught in this. I didn't want this for you. Clara looked at him, her chest heavy with the weight of his apology. But she couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. Not now. She had made her choice. Tell me everything, she said quietly. Tell me what's going on. Tell me how to stop them. Her father's eyes darkened. He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the same worn envelope from the video footage. Clara's breath caught. It was the same one, the one her father had passed to Jason in the alley. He handed it to her, his fingers trembling as he did. This is the only thing that can end this, Clara, he said, his voice trembling. But I warn you, once you open it, there's no going back. You'll be tied to this forever. Clara took the envelope from him, her fingers cold against the paper. It felt heavy in her hands, as if it carried the weight of everything her father had done, everything that had been hidden from her. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart racing. The truth was inside. She could feel it. The answers. The lies. Everything. With one final look at her father, Clara slowly tore open the envelope, her breath held in anticipation. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. She unfolded it, the words written in sharp, angular handwriting. It was a list of names she didn't recognize except for one, Jason. And underneath, a date that chilled Clara to her very core. It was today. Her father's voice broke the silence. "You need to get out of here," he said urgently. "They'll be looking for you. They're coming, and they won't stop until they have what they want." Clara's mind was racing, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't afford to be scared. Not now. She looked at her father one last time. He was no longer the man who had raised her. He was a man burdened with a past he couldn't escape, a past that now seemed to be coming for them both. "I'll find out what this means," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "And I'll stop them." Her father's face was unreadable. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Clara knew what she had to do. She had started this journey to uncover the truth, and now there was no turning back. The answers were out there, but so were the dangers, and they were getting closer. Clara's grip on the envelope tightened as her mind churned with the revelations unfolding before her. The list of names, the ominous date, and the warning from her father echoed in her thoughts. She was no longer in control of just her life. This had become bigger, much bigger. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "They're coming." She had no idea who they were, but the urgency in his voice told her everything. Whoever these people were, they were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had everything they wanted. She couldn't stay here. Not with her father's warning hanging over her like a dark cloud. Not with the list of names and that chilling date looming over her. She needed to get ahead of this. She needed to find Jason. She needed to find out who else was involved in this shadowy world her father had been part of. But where to start? Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of a door slamming in the distance. A heavy thud. Footsteps, hurried and urgent. They were coming, just like her father had said. Her breath quickened as panic began to seep in. She looked at her father one last time. His face was pale, drained of any color. His eyes were filled with an expression she couldn't place. Fear, regret, and something darker, something she hadn't seen before. "Go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her coat and ran for the door, her mind racing. She had no plan, no clear direction, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay here. The cold night air hit her as she stepped outside. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty alleyways, but Clara didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. She turned a corner and disappeared into the shadows, clutching the envelope tightly in her hand. The cold metal of the streets beneath her feet felt strangely comforting, grounding her in the moment. She couldn't afford to think about what she was running from. She had to think about what she was running toward. Her eyes darted around, scanning every figure in the distance, every movement. She had no idea where she was going or who she was running from, but something in her gut told her she was being followed. It was only a matter of time before they caught up with her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sudden, jarring interruption. Clara's pulse spiked as she pulled it out, half expecting a call from her father, a warning or a plea for her to return. But it wasn't him. It was a text message. Asterisk, "You can't hide from them forever. They know what you're looking for." Asterisk. Clara froze. The word sent a chill down her spine. She looked around nervously, half expecting someone to leap out from the shadows. Who is this? Her fingers trembled as she typed a quick reply. Who is this? The response came almost immediately. Asterisk, you don't need to know. Just know that you're in danger. They'll find you. Asterisk. Clara's mind raced. Who could possibly be watching her? The threat was real, and whoever was behind it had eyes everywhere. She shoved the phone back in her pocket, her hands shaking as the realization sank in. This wasn't just her father's mess anymore. She was tangled in something much bigger, something that didn't just involve Jason or her father, but a web of people, dangerous people, all connected in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. And they were coming for her. She picked up her pace, moving faster, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get somewhere safe. Somewhere far from here. But where? The only person she could think of was Jason. The boy from her past. The one whose disappearance had sent her down this path. He was the only person who might know what was going on, the only one who could help her navigate the treacherous waters she was now drowning in. Clara's mind flashed back to the moment in the alley, the fleeting glimpse of Jason's face in the shadows. There was so much she still didn't know about him, so much he hadn't told her. But she couldn't waste any more time. She had to find him. She had to get the answers, even if it meant risking everything. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts as she sprinted through the quiet streets, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Every step was a step closer to the truth, but also a step closer to whatever dangers lay ahead. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Her father had lied to her. Jason had disappeared. And now there were people out there, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. But Clara couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Not until she had the answers. Not until she understood what had happened to her family, and what it all had to do with Jason. And as she ran through the dark streets, one thought kept running through her mind. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it, no matter what it took. Clara's footsteps echoed in the silent streets, the rhythm of her hurried pace, steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. She had to find Jason. The name in the envelope, his name, kept repeating in her mind, like an alarm bell ringing louder with every step. Jason was key to everything. He was the missing piece she needed to understand the web her father had entangled her in. The cold air bit at her skin, but Clara hardly noticed. She was too focused, too desperate to find the truth. She turned another corner, her eyes scanning the dark alleyways, the shadows that seemed to swallow everything around her. Every corner she turned, every passing figure, made her heart race a little faster. Was someone following her? Had they found her already? She looked over her shoulder, but the street behind her was empty. No, she couldn't afford to be paranoid. She had to keep moving, keep searching. Clara's phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket without hesitation. Another message from the mysterious texter. Asterisk, you're too close. They're watching you. It's already too late. Asterisk. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and anger. Who were these people? And why couldn't they just let her uncover the truth? She typed furiously, trying to get answers. Asterisk, who are you? What do you want from me? Asterisk. The response came instantly. Asterisk, just stay away. They'll kill you if you get too close. Asterisk. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a slap. Kill. She had been playing a dangerous game all along, but now she realized just how deadly it truly was. Whoever was behind all of this was willing to go to any lengths to keep her from uncovering the truth. They had killed before, and they would kill again if necessary. But Clara didn't have time to think about that. She had to keep moving. She remembered the last place she saw Jason, the abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of town. It had always been a place of mystery, a place where things went in but never came out. She had always thought it was just rumors, just a piece of the town's dark history, but now she knew better. It was a part of the puzzle she needed to solve. She made her way to the old warehouse, her footsteps quicker now, more urgent. As she got closer, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air around her seemed to hum with tension, every sound amplified in the eerie quiet of the night. Finally, she reached the warehouse. The massive, crumbling building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the door hanging on its rusted hinges. She hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. The truth was inside, and she wasn't about to back down now. She pushed open the door, stepping into the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Clara's heart raced as she moved deeper into the building, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She called out softly, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound confident. "Jason? Are you here?" No answer. She took another step, the sound of her shoes on the concrete floor the only noise in the cavernous space. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But her legs wouldn't listen. They carried her forward, deeper into the heart of the warehouse. And then she heard it, a soft shuffle of footsteps, barely audible. Her breath caught in her throat, and her pulse quickened. Was it him? Jason, she called again, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's eyes darted around, but the shadows seemed to shift and twist, hiding whatever, or whoever, was lurking in the dark. She took another step forward, her senses heightened. Her hand gripped the envelope in her pocket, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. What was she hoping to find? What had Jason gotten himself mixed up in? Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim light. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. It was Jason, but something was different. He was thinner, paler, his eyes hollow as if he hadn't slept in days. There was a coldness about him, a darkness that didn't belong. He wasn't the boy she remembered. Jason? Clara whispered, her voice wavering with a mix of fear and hope. He didn't answer right away. His eyes locked onto hers, but it was as if he didn't recognize her. Clara, he finally said, his voice low, almost a growl. You shouldn't have come. Clara's heart pounded as she stepped closer. I had to find you, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to know what's going on. What is this? What are you involved in? Jason shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. It's too late for you, Clara. You should have stayed away. His words sent a chill down her spine. She could feel it now, the danger, the suffocating weight of the situation. The shadows that had been chasing her all night were no longer just in the darkness around her. They were in Jason's eyes, in the very air between them. You're in this too, Jason, she said, her voice stronger now. I'm not leaving until I understand. Who are these people? What have you gotten yourself into? Jason's gaze flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as though the old Jason, the one she used to know, might break through. But then, just as quickly, that fleeting look of vulnerability was replaced by cold detachment. You don't get it, Clara, he said, his voice dark and emotionless. You're already too far in. They know you're here. They've been watching you. And there's nothing I can do to protect you anymore. Clara's breath hitched. The walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of his words settling on her chest like a boulder. You have to leave, Jason repeated, his voice now tinged with desperation. Before it's too late. But Clara knew better than to listen. She had come this far. She wasn't going to back down now. Tell me everything, Jason, she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. I'm not leaving until I know what's really going on. Jason's face twisted in anguish, and for a moment, Clara thought he might finally break. But then he stepped back, shaking his head. It's too late, he whispered again, his voice hollow, broken. You don't know what you're asking for. And before she could react, he turned and vanished back into the shadows. Clara stood there, frozen, her mind racing. She had come so close. But now, the truth seemed further away than ever. Clara stood alone in the darkness, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on her. He had just disappeared, slipping back into the shadows as if he were part of the darkness itself. His warning echoed in her mind. It's too late. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected answers, clarity, but instead, all she had was confusion and dread. What did he mean by, it's too late? Was there something coming for her? Something worse than what she had already encountered? The silence in the warehouse felt suffocating. Clara strained her ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, any sign that Jason was still nearby. But all she could hear was her own breath, her heartbeat thudding in her chest. She had to find him. She couldn't leave empty-handed, not after everything. Not after everything she had uncovered, every secret her father had hidden, every danger he had warned her about. Clara turned on her heel, her eyes scanning the darkness once more. She didn't know where to go next. Jason had given her nothing to work with. The shadows around her seemed to move, to stretch in unnatural ways. It felt as if the very walls were closing in. And then, there it was, a faint sound in the distance, barely audible, but unmistakable. The creak of a door. Clara froze. Her mind raced. Had Jason gone through that door? Was someone else in the building with her? She couldn't be sure. She couldn't take any chances. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get out of the warehouse and disappear into the night. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she had answers. She walked cautiously toward the sound, her feet light on the cold concrete floor. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. She reached the door, the rusty hinges creaking as she nudged it open. On the other side was a narrow hallway, lit only by the faintest sliver of light coming from a crack in the ceiling. Clara could hear voices now, hushed but urgent. She stepped forward, her breath shallow. The voices grew clearer as she approached, and she could make out fragments of conversation. "Won't stop until we find it. Too dangerous to let her get any closer. Get rid of her before she figures it out." Clara's blood ran cold. They were talking about her. The voices grew louder, and she pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. The tension in the air was thick. She knew she had to stay hidden. She couldn't be seen, not now. Not when she was so close to finding out the truth. She peered around the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. A group of men stood in the hallway, their backs to her. They were speaking in low, urgent tones, oblivious to her presence. Clara strained to listen, trying to catch any hint of useful information. But then, one of the men turned, his eyes locking onto hers. For a split second, their gazes met. Her heart skipped a beat. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something dark in his eyes, something that sent a chill down Clara's spine. And before she could react, he stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his words cold as ice. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't been fast enough. She had been seen. The man took another step toward her, and Clara's mind raced. She couldn't afford to panic. She had to stay calm. She had to think of a way out. Without thinking, she turned and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. Behind her, the man shouted, his voice filled with menace. "Get her!" Clara's pulse spiked. She could hear the heavy thud of footsteps behind her, growing louder with every second. They were chasing her. They weren't going to let her escape. She sprinted down the hallway, her breath ragged, her feet pounding against the floor. Her mind raced as she searched for an exit. She could hear them closing in, could hear their voices growing louder. There was a door ahead. She could see the faint outline of it in the dim light. She reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Panic surged through her veins. She turned, her eyes darting around the hallway. Another door, this one partially open. She rushed toward it, not caring about the noise now, not caring if they heard her. She had to get out. She pushed the door open, nearly stumbling as she stepped into a small, dark room. She slammed it shut behind her, breathing heavily as she leaned against it, trying to calm her racing heart. For a moment, everything was still. The sounds of the chase faded, and Clara allowed herself a brief moment to collect her thoughts. She didn't know how long she could stay hidden. She didn't know how far they were behind her. But one thing was clear. Whatever had been going on in that warehouse, whatever dark secrets Jason and her father had been hiding, it was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, they were coming for her. That Clara's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick succession as she pressed her back against the door. The room around her was cold, damp, and devoid of warmth. There were no windows, no escape routes she could see. Just the echo of her heartbeat in the silence. She hadn't dared to look behind her as she slammed the door shut, but she could feel their presence. They were close. Too close. The darkness inside the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on her, making it harder to think clearly. She needed to get out. She needed answers. But what if running only made things worse? Clara pulled herself together, wiping the sweat from her palms as she gripped the envelope once again. Inside it were the last remnants of her father's secrets, the keys to everything that had led her here. She knew she couldn't waste time. She had to figure out what Jason had been hiding, and why it mattered so much to the people chasing her. The distant sounds of footsteps echoed, muffled by the walls, but they were getting closer. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the envelope open. The papers inside crinkled as they revealed more of the twisted truth. There, in bold letters, was a name she hadn't expected, someone she had never known to be involved. It was Jason's name. He was the connection to the larger conspiracy. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Jason wasn't just a victim. He was a part of it all. Her father had never been the hero she had wanted to believe in. He had been complicit in something far darker, something far more dangerous than she had imagined. The sound of the door rattling brought her back to reality. Clara snapped the envelope shut, her mind racing. Whoever was outside, whoever was after her, was getting closer. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had to make a choice. Fight or flee. She couldn't escape forever, but for now, running was all she could do. She had to get out of the building, find Jason, and confront the truth head-on. She wasn't going to be the victim. Clara pushed open the door, stepping into the hallway, ready to face whatever came next. But the hallway was empty, and that's when she realized the real enemy wasn't just the people chasing her. It was the truth she was about to uncover. Clara hesitated in the dim hallway, the silence now stretching out, heavy and suffocating. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but something had shifted inside her. The danger was real. The people behind her, whatever they were relentless, but they weren't the only threat. The truth she was chasing had its own power, and it was consuming her, changing everything she thought she knew. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the stale, musty air of the warehouse, listening for the telltale sounds of movement. But the place seemed abandoned, empty, too quiet. Her eyes glanced at the papers in her hand. They felt like a weight now, more than just a clue, more like a burden. Jason's betrayal was the final piece of the puzzle, but it was a piece that had shattered her understanding of everything. Her father's secrets, her family's legacy, had all been part of something much darker. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore, or if anyone, even herself, could escape the web of lies that had ensnared them all. With a final, steadying breath, Clara made her decision. She would find Jason, face him, and get the answer she needed, even if the truth destroyed everything. Because now she understood, there was no going back. There was no more hiding. The world she had once known was gone. She stepped forward, walking down the hall with determination. The shadows seemed to shift around her, as if watching her every move, but Clara didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to anymore. Not when she had come this far. In the distance, the faint sound of footsteps echoed again, this time unmistakable, familiar. She stopped. It was him. Jason stood in the doorway ahead, his face pale, but there was something different about him now. Something softer, almost defeated. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Clara saw the rawness in them. The man she had once known was still there, buried beneath the layers of fear and guilt. "You shouldn't have come," Jason said softly, his voice breaking. Clara swallowed hard, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I had to. I need the truth." For a moment there was silence. Then, with a deep sigh, Jason stepped aside, a subtle invitation to follow him. Clara walked past him, into the dimly lit room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of everything she had learned settle on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth, but she knew that facing it was the only way to move forward. And finally she would. Jason closed the door behind them, and they stood together in the darkness, the echoes of their past lives now silent. The truth was there, waiting to be revealed. And at last Clara was ready to face it,